My name's Steve Gardner. I am the Managing Director of Healthcare World. Welcome again. I've got the great honour this morning of having the opportunity to chair a panel myself. This morning's topic is translational healthcare. Translational healthcare, which I think is something that although I've been involved in international healthcare for 7 or 8 years, this is a really new topic to me as well. It's a new innovation, it's a new idea and a new way of going about particularly bringing innovation into our healthcare systems and doing so in a way that is commercial. Whether that word is controversial or not, it's something we'll get into in the course of this debate, and in a way which is practical and puts the patient at the heart of what we're trying to do. To discuss this very new idea, we have a fantastic panel. I'm going to ask them to very briefly introduce themselves. Let's start. I'm going to go with the order that they are on my screen. Let's start with Jane Kinghorn from UCL. Just give us a very quick introduction to yourself, who you are and what you bring to this debate.
Hi, I'm Jane Kinghorn. I'm delighted to be part of the panel, so thank you very much for asking me to participate. I'm Director of the Translational Research Office here at UCL, and my role and that of my team is really to navigate the innovation ecosystem between the active researchers in the university and their counterparts within the hospital partners that we have, really to deliver innovative research into practical use within the environment.
Thanks, Jane. Moving on to Joseph Fehrenbach.
Hi, my name is Joseph Fehrenbach. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto. I wear many hats, one of which is that I run a translational research program, which teaches graduate students to think differently about innovation and implementing research into contexts. I'm also the associate director and co-founder of the Health Innovation Hub, which is our incubator at the Faculty of Medicine. And I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Joseph. Austin Gibbs.
Hi, good morning. Thanks, Steve, for inviting me to join this panel. My name's Dr. Austin Gibbs. I am the director of the Allen Lab, which is an immersive health technologies research laboratory in Jersey. Really, my role was to create a vehicle where we could practically do this translational research in Jersey and actually take these innovations and start working with clinicians and get them embedded as soon as possible. So that, I guess, I sit at the front line of this.
And on to Heather Ann Hubble.
Thanks very much. I am the CEO and founder of Fundex Limited, which is delighted to sponsor this session today. And I have an area of expertise in helping businesses improve their processes and getting to market faster. And Professor Fehrenbach and I have spent the last couple of years really thinking about what that means in terms of healthcare. And we've been looking at developing the Fundex platform to make that work a lot easier. So delighted to be here this morning.
Thanks, Heather Ann. And finally, Paul Guthrie.
Yeah, thanks again for including me. Paul Guthrie, I'm an entrepreneur. I've started 3 businesses that all have a very deep science or technology background, 2 very focused on AI. The one that I run right now is a reinsurance company that focuses on cybersecurity. But before that, I was running an AI company that did a lot of work in biotech. I spent about 10 years at NASA headquarters doing science and technology strategy. And I have an early career as an elite athlete and as a coach. And so I've seen a lot of the evolution of science writ large and how it's applied to different ecosystems in athletics and in medical contexts, in research and so on.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks very much to the panel. So we've got a really interesting group of experts. I think we're going to have a fascinating debate over the next hour and a half. Can I ask, please, those of you that are watching the session, I am monitoring the chat. If you look on the platform, you'll see the tab that says live discussion. Please post your questions there, and I'll pass them on to the panel. But to start with, I'd like to understand, and I think it's great actually for me as a chair, being not unlike you guys. I'm no expert on this topic, so I'm learning as much as our audience do, and almost being their proxy in this conversation. So let's start with the really, really obvious question: what does this phrase "translational healthcare" actually mean? I'd like to go to each panelist in turn and just get a quick thought from each of you on what the definition of translational healthcare is. Let's go in the same order that we did the introductions in. So let's start with Jane Kinghorn from UCL.
Great. Well, I guess that term means many things to many people. So my background, I did work in large pharma in drug discovery, and then about 10 years ago, I moved to UCL. So I've seen the translational healthcare from both sides of the coin, if you like. And with my hat on in academia, or pharma, actually, it's about understanding what's the requirement from a patient perspective, or if we're talking interventions, or a system perspective, if we're talking hospitals, and really signposting that need and working with the academic groups that can deliver a solution for that need to help them move that forward. And really, translational healthcare is putting the process, the steps, and the support required for those researchers to move their ideas to address that unmet need. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell. There's lots of steps in that process, and it's really about validating along the process and checking in your assumptions are still valid.
It's a great kickoff, Jane. Thanks so much for that. Joseph, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm just going to build on that because I think that's a good base. I think that many people assume that, wow, I have this great idea, eureka moment, and it is going to change the world of care, period. That you instantly, magically somehow go from the research innovation into a whole new paradigm. But the reality is much more banal. There tends to be a lot of testing, a lot of work in very incremental steps, which not every researcher really can do, wants to do, or is interested in doing. But then even as you get stuff out of research institutes and academia, there's this next step. Just because it works in one context and in one hospital or in one community center, it doesn't magically work everywhere around the globe. Each application of research or knowledge has contextual differences that make it important to be able to work out some of these ideas beforehand based on the context to ensure better implementation and success, more effective, less costly, and with benefits to people.
And I think that's a really good point, because part of what we're talking about here, the whole concept of translational healthcare, is getting stuff out of the laboratory and out into the world. And I guess, Austin, as somebody who's working, in your case, in the Jersey healthcare system, this is where you've come in, isn't it? It's where do we move from research to reality?
I spent sort of the first part of my career working in emergency medicine all over the world and being handed various bits of kit and various procedures and things to try and implement on the shop floor. It's a very rapidly changing speciality, emergency medicine. And what was very clear is the phrase no plan survives first contact with the enemy. It applies very, very truthfully in healthcare. The moment you put something in the hands of a patient or a doctor, things happen to it that you could not possibly have predicted, either beneficial or negative. And having seen that, and having seen that, particularly in digital healthcare, it's a very rapidly evolving field. But in this case of things like software, these are adapting and changing all the time. And there needs to be a much closer link between the front line and that research, so that there's a rapidly exchanging of ideas and a rapid exchanging of what's needed. So that's what we did with the Allen Lab. So we'll take things that are relatively new, particularly in the world of digital health, and actually just get them out there and start using them as they were intended to use, not necessarily to do the care side, because that's where the regulation and the testing comes in, but to help do that kind of, in software world, alpha and beta testing, to make sure that it's actually going to do what we need it to do and work in the way that it needs to work. That means that when we get to a stage that we're again going to be doing the regulation, the FDA, making sure it's safe and everything else, we've kind of worked out all the nitty-gritty stuff of the practicalities of how this is going to be tested, so that we're not spending our time going back and redoing that when we can be just gathering data to prove that it's safe, or that it's effective, or that its outcomes beneficial.
So I guess, you covered there the point about taking research and innovation out of the university environment, out of the research environment, and putting it into a practical healthcare environment. The other thing that's required in order to do that is funding, is finance. And I guess, Adoran, that's where you come in.
Yeah, we're very much looking at how do you take that idea, confirm that it's a solution that actually solves a problem that people need and want, and then how do you then commercialize it and get it out into the public domain in a way that is efficient and enables the healthcare providers to find the funding that they need to get it commercialized and then be able to take it out to the clients themselves. Joseph and I have spent the last couple of years working through how do we help healthcare incubators manage the process of the startups and get them through those steps, which can be quite painful to get the funding required to be able to get out to market, and how can we improve that funding experience along the way.
So coming to Paul then last, I mean, how does this, from your point of view, Paul, what is this technique then? What is this kind of juju that we're talking about here that somehow ties all of these bits together? The first opportunity to say the
so is the technology person that screws up the mute button. I would say that I don't have a huge amount to add when it comes to the academic definitions of translational medicine, but I would say that when I happened upon it, I couldn't have been more delighted about it, because I would characterize some of the early movements of my career as being incredibly interested in those general concepts. And I'll kind of add two analogies of why I think this is so important. And first of all, I'll thank Austin for introducing into this conversation the analogy around software development, because I was going to do it, but didn't want to be, the software guy saying, oh, even this is like software development. But I think that, software engineering, to put it more broadly, is an example of engineering that's proven over and over again that you need not just a little bit of contact with the customer in the use case, but a huge amount of contact with the customer in the use case, and that there's a huge amount of feedback that needs to be drawn out of that. And the best solutions that are not only the most commercialized, but the ones that are actually used by individuals for a lot of benefit, those are the ones that have co-evolved with their customers over time and have adapted with their customers, gotten more and more deeper about what that field is. And that can be quite technical. It can also be quite, behavioral. But either way, there's a flow of information, and people can maybe be too precious about what medical information is. It can be just data like anything else, and having those feedbacks is essential. And part of the reason that this is so important to me is that when I was younger and I was an athlete, I found that I was also a student of the philosophy of science. So I was coming at this with a bit of a background, but I found that when it came to injury prevention or training methodology or recovery, that there was really no resources available to me if I were to go speak to a doctor. In many ways, they were the worst people to talk to, because they thought they knew the entire universe of things that might be helpful. And in fact, they were just very attached to the ideas that they did have, which don't really speak very directly to, what do you really need for nutrition? How do you really cure like a subclinical, muscle tightness that hasn't caused an injury yet, but you are certain as an athlete will? And how do you get the resources to find people that are actually working closely with individuals and that know how to manage those types of subclinical things, those types of, long-term issues in medicine, and saw that as a huge hole that would affect not just athletics, but, a lot of conditions that become clinical eventually. And so I studied a bunch of this in grad school, but didn't really find a professional outlet for it at the time. So again, when I see everyone here talking about these, and when I see what the University of Toronto is doing, it's just exciting from a contribution to the world perspective.
So, okay, but ultimately, my takeaway from that, though, from all of your answers, is that what we're talking about here is collaboration. We're talking about how you bring the bits together in order to make the innovations work. I guess the question that springs to mind for me from that is, okay, this is all great. This is all nice and theoretical. Which of you can give me an example of this actually happening in practice? I mean, Austin, you talked about first contact with the enemy. Have you got an example of an idea that has survived first contact with the enemy? And another mute button.
And the technology guy as well, the geek. I'm just keeping you sane, Paul. Yeah, I mean, for us, I mean, the classic, I suppose the classic example, because it's quite nice to sort of walk through a practical example for everyone, would be for us working with Ultromics. So there's a company that began with a PhD, Dr. Paul Leeson. Our clinical director was one of the people involved in his PhD in helping to review it. That then developed into a software algorithm, an AI algorithm for echocardiograms. We then worked with them on starting to implement that as how that would work in our clinical flow and how that would best work over the next couple of years. It's now developed into a full-blown software as a service, and we are now the first clinical users of that. So we've gone through that entire journey from start to finish, from working with the PhD of an esoteric academic topic, but having massive clinical application and saying this will be really useful if we could make it work in a clinical setting, and then going all the way through till literally this week we are fully live now with a clinical service which started in the academic research, but at the entire journey we've been involved from the beginning. So there's been a two-way flow all the way through, and that's worked really, really well. And the net result is we now have a system that works brilliantly for us, works brilliantly for our physiologists, works great for the company because they understand. We've also changed a little bit about, we've managed to change a little bit about how our government sees these software as a revenue rather than a capital expenditure, trying to change that funding model, because I'm not averse to commercialization. I actually think that commercialization's most useful thing is it provides a very, very powerful sort of Darwinian selection measure on those innovations. If you survive in a commercial world, that's probably because you've worked very closely with your end users. So it actually provides a nice kind of litmus test of the good and useful healthcare innovations. And yeah, that's how we've done it. So we've got a number of those. Some of those are still in the very early stages. So we're literally wiring patients up with, Arduino boards and things, trying to help them work with that. And then at the other end, we've got now a full clinical commercial service, which is now being rolled out across the NHS.
Brilliant. Joseph, you've got your hand up. Have you got an example you'd like to share?
Unfortunately, actually, I'm going to go against the grade and say I have hundreds. The problem is that this type of work is virtually invisible, because when you succeed, you save time and money, and that isn't seen necessarily as an outcome. When you fail by trial and error, doing the things without a process, then that you don't see those either. So this kind of work is about sort of how do you make this more efficient? We have at the Health Innovation Hub over the last 6-7 years produced well over 450 companies and ventures, some of which have gone on to some very outstanding success. The issue is, like this sort of lean business model, the key is to fail fast and fail early. The stuff that's not going to work, you don't want to keep working on it. You want to be able to turf it, and you want to move on to something else. And so those are the things you don't see, is that quick decision making, those relationships between academics, industry, usually traditionally have been done by trial and error or by cult of the personality. What we're advocating and working on are more systematic principles of making this work better and more efficiently.
So yeah, no, I think that's an interesting point. I think that idea that any kind of venture and any idea, you almost want to knock it down as quickly as you can. I mean, following up on that, Joseph, can you give me any kind of an impression of, we talk about the process. What does the process look like?
Well, actually, all of my colleagues on the panel have alluded to bits and pieces that we've put together as part of a best practices framework. First of all, and this might sound almost silly, ask your market, ask your potential customer, go and find identify a legitimate need that actually exists, that's not in your head. Or if you have technology or a pharmaceutical or a process, actually step out of your research thinking, go into the context and talk to the potential patients, users, people, clients, before you spend a lot of money developing something that maybe nobody wants. So the first step is identifying a need. Then you need to be able, specifically in healthcare, think about how do you frame that need? What are the jurisdictional, legal contexts, regulatory contexts within which you're going to have to build out? So understanding the area in which you're playing can save a lot of money. I can give examples, though not officially, of researchers who would go and do clinical trials for the FDA that would have a p-value that was a little off, and would have to spend 3-4 years repeating experiments just to get approval, when if they had gone and investigated up front some of the things they actually needed to do, they could have saved a lot of time and money. So once you sort of have it framed, defining the nature of the problem you're trying to solve. Like, these are somewhat revolutionary concepts in the world of health science and research, but they're not all that revolutionary in the world of business. They're not all that revolutionary in practical implementation. Find out what you want to do, what problem you're trying to solve, and then before you even try, have that knowledge base define the requirements you need to start ideating, to start prototyping, and then to start developing something that you can then test.
So in many ways, the translational element of translational healthcare is we are translating the language of the academic into the language of the healthcare system, into the language of the people that actually fund and put the commercial money behind all of these things. Jane, you, I think, had something you wanted to add on this.
Yeah, just following up on Joseph's point. So the systematic approach, what we've done here at UCL is embed those sort of translational applied scientists with knowledge from industry as to how to move things forward. Embedded that support for our academics and our clinicians, and coming back to the unmet need. So my particular example is in gene and cell therapy. Here at UCL, we have, over the last 10 years, spun out 10 companies, therapeutic companies in this space. And really, when we started 10 years ago, because of our close association with the university researchers, with our hospitals, we have these dual appointments of clinical researchers. So our clinicians are active researchers and are actively seeing patients and trying to address the needs of those patients. And in rare diseases, especially, gene therapy is an approach that's being pioneered. And at that time, 10 years ago, you know, when there was potentially a methodology to address some of these really awful, rare childhood diseases in particular, but also early adult diseases, the technology was there, was being progressed, worked up within the academic base. There was no commercial market for gene therapy. And to be fair to our Medical Research Council, they, because of the unmet need and the ability to see a really clearly defined milestone met project plan, were willing to put the money in. And, you know, over that 10 years, we have forged new therapies through public funding to take these gene therapies into the clinic, into phase 2, and subsequently, I think because of the regulations changing around orphan drug disease, giving it a potential market, that we've now seen venture capitalist money come in. And as I said, we've spun out 10 companies in the last 10 years.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because actually, some of the ideas that and the innovations that are coming through now may not have commercial application immediately. So I think that there's an interesting kind of point to be raised about whether there is a role for the state and the healthcare system in terms of putting money and putting funding into stuff that may not have application for a period of time to come. We've got a question from the audience. So Siddhesh Kumar, thank you very much for this. Asking what are the barriers preventing translators from translating their ideas? I'm going to come to Heather Ann on this one first, because one of the barriers, I presume, to translating ideas into practice is going to be funding, isn't it? It's going to be money.
It's very much going to be translating it from an idea into a business concept, and then figuring out how to get that funding. So Joseph talked about failing early and often. Having a tried and true process to put things through, to be able to capture early on, have we really got a winner that people are interested in spending some money on, is really important. And then you need to put people through a process that says, do we have a really viable business? Is it economically feasible? Are there any regulations out there we need to worry about? And if you're doing those on one-off basis, it becomes really time-consuming and very difficult to be able to get yourself to the stage where you can go out to funding. Joseph and I were talking about this some time ago, and he said, Fundex is really improving the funding experience. And it's about taking ideas and concepts through a tried and trusted process that enables them to be able to go out into the marketplace and to seek that funding more easily. Most of our participants will be familiar with the concept of care pathways. And what we've done at Fundex is come up with the concept of transaction pathways to take people through what are understood to be reasonably well understood processes from a business perspective that you need to get to take your business opportunity out to market for funding, but isn't always so clearly understood in the medical world, particularly for the early stage and developers. And it gives them an opportunity to understand what that process is early, so they can start completing those steps along the way and not get hit with them at a stage where they've invested an awful lot of time and effort of their own into it, and then suddenly find that there's a hurdle commercially that they're never going to be able to get across to be able to get out to funding.
So again, I mean, coming back to that point about the translational element is changing the language. You've got a situation where a clinician or an entrepreneur with a good idea may not be able to translate that into a commercially viable opportunity, something that actually works. Paul, I want to bring you in on this one because you come from a tech background. This is quite a familiar idea in tech world, isn't it? Testing a concept, making sure that you're actually solving a problem that exists. Have you seen examples of the way in which this translational approach has helped to improve that?
Yeah, I guess I'll talk about my company Valor for a second, not as an advertisement, but because I think this is a really interesting case study. And what we're doing with Valor is we're commercializing some technology around non-invasive blood lactate testing. And the significance of this is that I'm talking about endurance training here. So anything like running marathons or actually training for anything over 2 minutes, that the world is a little unfair, that there's a very psychologically satisfying training zone, meaning an intensity at which one would run. That's not very effective for actually improving any functional elements of your body. So what I mean by that in practical terms is that 99 out of 100 people that go running to try to get better find this physiologically satisfying zone, this zone that feels good to run in. And that is not a zone that is at all good for improving your physiological function. So when most people run or cycle or whatever, they're not really improving all that much. And by using non-invasive blood lactate, we can actually pinpoint exactly where you're stressing certain types of systems in your body and encourage users to train at those levels of intensity. And when that happens, they get extraordinary outcomes. And so you can use this for elite athletes. And in fact, elite athletes do this all the time, only with invasive blood lactate. But by doing it non-invasively, we're allowing a normal person, a normal user, to get out and go running and experience a very, very rapid improvement in their physiology. Now, the reason that I think that this is an important case study for this is that the science behind these physiological functions is quite old. It goes back to the 50s and 60s. It was mostly developed kind of in Eastern Europe, and it was mostly applied to athletics, sports. And it was done in a method that today would be considered translational medicine. You had physiologists taking blood samples on machines and in the weight room and developing data sets and finding out who was improving and why, and then rolling that back into the training methodology. So it's 60 years later, and some of these scientific principles, they still haven't been integrated at all into our culture. that was too extreme. They have really been integrated, but only at the elite level, not at all in the level of like a normal person. And it's because there's not really the technology to create a really strong feedback loop that tells individuals, you know, here's this concept, first of all, and also here's how you actually adhere to this concept. And so you can kind of see in this example why it's so important that just because you discover something scientifically, that's no guarantee that it's going to actually get implemented. That's no guarantee that it's actually going to, you know, have a viable business that exploits it and uses it and diffuses it. And it's no guarantee that it's actually going to like really make a difference in culture. And it's also an example of how, you know, you can't, the reason that we invest in my company is mostly just user interface and behavioral change oriented, because we know that you can't just tell people, hey, here's what the science says and expect that they're actually going to do it. You have to give people a tool that rewards them psychologically, that makes it easy for them to understand what you're talking about without having to talk about the science. And that's kind of that gap, the gap between science and commercialization and use and cultural change is not just a checkbox where you say, hey, what's the step? It is a giant area that is unstructured, that needs its own art and science and, you know, interdisciplinary collaboration to figure out how to bridge that gap.
It's interesting because the phrase that when I was sort of researching, trying to get an understanding of what translational healthcare is and what it looks like, is this phrase bench to bedside. But there's a third step to that, isn't there? Bench to bedside is great because we're talking about translating academic research ideas into practical stuff that clinicians can use. But there's the third step is actually patient. You know, the patient at the end of the day is the heart of healthcare. Austin, I'm going to come to you on this one because I know you've had some experience working directly with the health system there in Jersey. How does translational medicine actually help the patient to understand what this innovation looks like?
I think involving them very early on, because we're all patients and we're all carers. You know, this idea that patients is a separate entity, we're all part of the same community. For us, involving our patients very early on and what we're trying to do and what this is and why we're doing it and helping to educate them around the science helps that feedback process they can understand. So we might have maybe 5 or 6 individuals that we're doing some fairly onerous things with, you know, wiring up for 48 hours, asking them to activity track, do all with everything else. It's no good giving them an information leaflet and saying, we're doing this to advance, yada, yada, yada. I actually try and work directly with them and say, look, PPG, which is what we're working on at the moment, if we can get this to work as a way, it means you see that Fitbit that you've got on your arm, we can get that data off when you come into clinic, which means I don't have to send you away for another test. It means you don't have to come in for another outpatient, you don't have to find another car parking place, and you don't have to be here 6 or 7 times over 6 months. So really showing them what that practically means to them, why we're doing this, and making that link between the two. But that's also true of clinicians when I'm trying to do things with clinicians as well, saying, look, I know you've been shown 1 million EPRs before, but this particular intervention will mean that you can do your blood tests on the beach rather than in the hospital. And that means you can spend more time with the kids. And then that gets that engagement because they can see a practical outcome. We're all talking about these outcome-based measures, but the outcome-based measures of time, money, all these things, these are how we're going to drive this. This is how you're going to mark this. This is how you're going to do it. And having the patients involved in that from the various early stages means you get great feedback because they understand the concept of what you're trying to do. So the feedback you get is directly related to what you're trying to achieve. And it works really well for us. We're really lucky here in Jersey to have really very encouraging and keen people who really want to be involved in this because they just want to have a modern healthcare service. I think everyone realizes that healthcare is probably the last industry to effectively go through a digital revolution and is decades behind everywhere else for all sorts of reasons, mostly cultural, mostly investment and money as well, and mostly because of the lag. So you can't, you know, you talk to your chief executive and say, look, we'll introduce this, but you're not going to see savings for 10 years. Yeah, that's a difficult one to sell, but it is coming. And that we're really lucky that the patients themselves are actually starting to drive this because they're kind of fed up. They come in and they say, well, why can't you see my result? I can see, like, I've just done my shopping on Amazon and I've video called my mother-in-law in Australia. Why am I coming in and you're flicking through a big pile of green notes and you can't find the result? You know, and so they're beginning to drive this. So by using that to help us, it works really, really well. And we get some amazing feedback and make some really good, go back to the research and say, look, I know you thought that was going to work. It really doesn't. And this is the reason why. I mean, recently we just had an interesting one. It itched. There was a little tag that itched, and we never have thought about that. But the guy said the problem is because it was itching all the time, I was conscious of it, and just little things like that. So yeah, involve the patients early, and tell them why we're doing it. Join them in the research.
It's really interesting. I think that talking about innovation in healthcare, which is clearly something that we've been doing a lot of over the last week or so at the festival. One thing that shouldn't be forgotten here is the fact that we have all been locked up for a year and a bit. And one thing that's really done is focus all of our minds as a global community on healthcare and on the development of healthcare. And it's probably pushed the development of digital healthcare particularly forward by about 10 years, I would have suggested. Joseph, I think you wanted to come in on this one.
Well, I wanted to come in on a lot of things, actually. So I think, first of all, the barriers are very complex. It's not just funding, although funding clearly at the early stages is a big deal. Funding between basic and clinical science is a big deal, but also performance measures. A lot of researchers are judged on the basis of publications, not on the basis of actually implementation. So when something is published, they go on to their next grant, not necessarily going on to develop it into something that is a product that is commercializable, which it doesn't necessarily mean profit hoarding bull, but that is sustainable and can be integrated into practice. Then even between those, the like you said, patients, their observations, their needs are not being integrated into research agendas. So even translating from the community back into basic science and into clinical science isn't happening as effectively as it should be. Patients should be involved from the beginning, and they're not. So there are a whole bunch of steps. And finally, my last point that I wanted to make is it goes well beyond translating the language between these groups. Language is only the surface. Beyond that is how do they work together? What are the mutual incentives? What are the structures that encourage, rewards for the academic versus rewards for the translator versus rewards for the industry partner? So it is translation of language, but it is also practice. It is also culture. It is also funding. And it's a very messy and complicated space, as Paul has hinted at, that between government-funded research to actually making it out into the market, there is this no person's land, this valley of death, where even good ideas end up dead because not because they're bad ideas, but because there are all these other factors that may come into play.
I think you've brought up some really, really interesting points. It's put a flurry of hands from the rest of the panel. Jane, you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, I just thought I'd inject a bit more positivity in there. I would say, some of the communication issues and the language issues are because traditionally we have been siloed in our organizations. And when I joined UCL 10 years ago, that was very true. Industry were quite insular, academia were quite insular, didn't really like to come out their comfort zone. The incentives were all misaligned. And as we've talked about earlier, the thing about translational healthcare is it's a team science. You need interdisciplinary, you need collaboration, you need partnership. But that over the 10 years has completely transformed in the UK, the landscape between the incentives of academics, the incentives of industry, the growth of biotech. I do believe that everybody, especially the academics, if they really want, and because of the close collaboration we have with our clinicians and patients, that they really do want to drive impact. Of course they want publications, of course they want another grant, but actually what's driving them is to make an impact for their patients. So that was all I was going to say. I really do think we have moved in the last 10 years. It's not perfect. And is there opportunities to do further? Of course there is. And I think in this past year has been hugely disruptive and allowed innovation to come to the fore. So we are in a good position now where the general public, I think, are seeing science on their TVs, on their radios, on their smartphones every day, and are thinking, I would like to be engaged. They're all doing citizen science projects at the moment. And I think somehow, we need to build on that and move with that.
I think you're absolutely right, Jane. I think it's I've said this once before this week, actually. It sounds awful to talk about the idea of a horrible, horrible situation of a global pandemic that has cost so many lives as having an upside. But if it does, then the upside is the fact that it's focused us on our healthcare, it's focused on the development of our healthcare. And as you say, it's made scientists of us all. It's made us all think about the science and innovation that sits behind healthcare. And actually, one question that might be worth considering, I'm not going to pose it right away, but maybe we'll come back to it a little bit later on. Has there been any element of translational healthcare involved in the development of the vaccine that we've just seen? I mean, is this an example? I can say, actually, do you know what? I am going to ask that question because I can see Joseph nodding. Joseph, is the vaccine an example of translational healthcare in action?
When have we ever had in human history a pathway from we have a problem to we have an intervention that is being rolled out in a year and a half? Vaccines used to take 10, 15, 20 years of development. And it is not to say that the fundamental technologies behind mRNAs and the vaccines that are coming out right now have not been in development for decades. But this is a case where there was expedited collaboration, cooperation between multiple labs, between multiple researchers, between government, between industry, and they were able to cut down pathways and barriers to a fraction of what they normally would be. There's still lots of challenges, but this is exactly the kind of system we need to not only learn from, but also implement going forward.
Jane, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this year has been hugely impressive in terms of the vaccine story and the collaborations and the breaking down of all of those barriers. It did require a superhuman effort on all of those players working round the clock, liaising with the regulators, working round the clock, people willing, because of that singular goal, that the aims and objectives were very clear and everybody's incentive was aligned. And that's what can be done if you do get the incentives aligned. That's you can exercise that sort of ability to cut through those barriers. I think we need, and we've all done exercises on what can we learn, how did we do that, what can we take forward. I think we'll see how that plays out over the next few years. But I think what was also clear was that people drove themselves into the ground almost, and that is unsustainable. So we'll just have to see what we can take forward and apply, but certainly this is a very unique situation, and not, when everybody is out doing the rest of their day job and you get incentives, how do we clear the backlog of all the diagnostic tests we need to do and all the surgery that we need to do, then other incentives come into play.
Joseph, you're keen to respond to that?
It is unique, but I think it is more than that. I think genuinely people did not think it possible to actually rapidly develop some of these areas that this has demonstrated, and I completely agree, on the backs of frontline workers, healthcare workers, researchers, many other people, because the system was not efficient, but it has demonstrated that it's possible. So the next challenge is, how do we make this the default that is sustainable and not just an incredible, unlikely, extraordinary circumstance?
How much of this can be turned into business as usual, and how much of it is actually the product of exceptional circumstances? Jane talked about the idea of people working above and beyond because of the necessity of the global pandemic, but there are some elements of this that are replicable and we can go on and use in the future. I've got a great question, actually. I wanted to go back to this question of commerciality, and I've got a brilliant question from one of our audience members. Thank you very much, Andrena Logue, for this. From the commerciality point of view, how far does the commercial model extend? For example, do healthcare providers get any royalty or IP through enabling access to patients, etc.? Or by commercialization, are we focusing purely on the venture capital front end? I want to go to Heather Ann on this one, because again, from my point of view, listening and understanding as we go through this, translational is about collaboration. So presumably, are we looking to bring in all of the different elements? And I guess the question here is, what's the healthcare provider's stake in a translational project?
Yeah, and I think it really needs to be a collaboration effort here. And to draw on what Jane and Joseph were talking about, I come from the financial services industry, and things that have changed dramatically as a result of the pandemic have been the assumption of things like being able to do automatic signatures and electronic signatures. And it's how do we keep that going systemically going forward, and how do we make sure that everybody is part of that collaboration hub is equally is rewarded in a way to encourage and incentivize to do them. You know, we talk about the massive improvements we've made on ways of dealing with healthcare around COVID because of the extraordinary efforts that our healthcare workers have made. If we don't pay them, we end up in a situation where we don't encourage anybody to come up with any new inventions. And so this isn't about funding to make money for the funders. This is about making it interesting and acceptable and accessible to people who have ideas, to make them available to the public, and to create a collaboration hub where you can share that information and be able to make the next step forward. I was talking to someone this morning about the vaccines. How come we've got such an amazing and quick worldwide response? Look, we've got so much feedback coming in because we have millions of people having those vaccine processes, and that collaboration around the world for singular purpose of trying to solve such a big issue. We should actually take that and use that as the way that we run all of our processes going forward. We've done it in financial services for years because the regulators bring in more regulation. You'll be very familiar with this in medical world, and then everybody runs around like headless chickens, standing on their heads, trying to figure out ways to be able to meet those regulations. The key is to build a sustainable process that every party gets to have a participating place in that process and is able to get rewarded for the aspect that they bring to the table. It's a utopia that we don't get to immediately, but if everybody comes at that from the same perspective of ultimately we need to get this to be more systemic and sustainable, then it becomes much easier for everybody to move forward with these ideas and get them out to the people that really need them.
Austin, I keep coming to you as our kind of representative of the front line, if you like. The question that Andrena asked there about specifically healthcare providers getting royalties or getting IP for giving access to the audience, not the audience, but to the patient, to the market. Is that something that you've seen?
Yeah, it's interesting. It comes down to that commercialization of the data. I think what you're talking about there is within healthcare, there are, terabytes, petabytes of data that go down the drain every day that aren't actually used effectively. And that vaccine is a classic case in point. We're now getting millions of data points, and that's that feedback loop that's helping. I think as time goes forward, we'll get to a stage. Certainly, what the model that we're looking at in Jersey is saying, okay, well, if we're going to keep the patient at the center of everything we do, it's the patient's data, and therefore we need to give them the mechanisms to potentially commercialize their data if they so wish. So a company can come and say, you know, we're working on a Jersey care record, so every patient owns their own data, has their own data, and we can say to a diabetes researcher, we can give you a list of all the diabetes patients. You can send a message, they can choose, and you can choose how you're going to commercialize that data to help push forward the research. That will help a lot, because companies need access to these patients. They need access to this to do this stuff that we're talking about. But the process by which we do that is a bit clunky and old, with information governance and consent forms and all this kind of stuff. It takes time, it takes effort. I think once we've got to a stage where we've got the patient data in the hands of the patient, so you own your own data and you can choose what to do with it, that will help drive the market forward. Because some of these patients go, you know what, I'm quite happy for you to look at my blood sugars for the last 6 months. I'm perfectly happy with that. You can give me £2 for that, happy days. And then that also helps with the commercialization side, because as Heather knows, having a roadmap for a company and be able to say, okay, we're planning to do phase 2, this is how we're going to do it, and this is going to be the cost of it, is often quite difficult to set up, and often quite difficult to be accurate at as a business, because you really don't know until you start doing the clinical research. Actually, do you know what? We need 2,000 patients for this. We don't need 1,000. We're going to have to double the size of it. We're going to have to take 6 months longer. You know, we talked about that p-value earlier with the FDA. It's a classic case in point, and that sort of stuff. So I think that will be the key part of it, rather than necessarily giving IP and money to the healthcare people that are doing it, saying, actually, we're going to commercialize the data, and you're going to be selling that data. And then as an institution as well, that's another revenue stream that can help drive forward innovation.
I think that's a really, really interesting point, Austin, because we talk a lot about the kind of democratization of healthcare data, and where the ownership of that data lies. It's all very well saying we're going to put people's healthcare data in their own hands, but at the end of the day, we have to give them an explanation and an understanding of what we're going to do with their data, and also, quite frankly, what's in it for them. Jane, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the data question is a really key one at the moment, obviously with the NHS, and they've set up their NHS X to look at this. And obviously we've got the Health Data Research UK as a national body to look at this aspects of being able to access clinical data for research purposes. And then, of course, every commercial company, in order to advance their products and make them better, need access to that data. So, I mean, I know with our hospital trust, that's the really hot topic of conversation at the moment in terms of, well, how do we best do that? But again, as well, in terms of the therapies that have been developed at our university, the diagnostics and devices, there's definitely a discussion ongoing about what does it mean, the contribution that one of the organizations has played, whether that be in recruiting patients to a trial, and how should that be recompensed or incentivized moving forward. So those are discussions at the moment between the university and its hospital trust partners as to what would some sort of shared reward, shared risk access be. So I don't have any answers, but we're definitely looking at that at the moment.
And again, I think for me, that kind of speaks to the heart of this translational project, doesn't it? Because it is about how you bring the bits together and make things work, and that requires some thinking. We're getting some absolutely brilliant questions, I have to say, on the chat. A very specific one, actually, from Michael DeVere, who wants to ask you, Austin, specifically a question. How would you recover fair value for the data in Jersey?
Sorry, say again, I missed that.
So Michael DeVere wants to know, how would Austin recover fair value for the data for Jersey?
I mean, you could argue that Google gave us a price for the data by breaking GDPR, getting fined, and then breaking it again. So they've sort of given us a commercial a marker of how much data actually costs. I think the fair value and the commercialization of someone's data is an incredibly thorny topic, and it needs a lot of careful consideration. I've been a bit glib when I say, oh, the patient can own the data and we can share it. That is the ideal. The discussion will be down to with our public. with our public themselves. I think you can allow market forces to a degree, but I think if you allow unregulated market forces, then you get into the nefarious, slightly unpleasant side of it. I think there needs to be some regulation over what data is ring fenced purely for academia and what data can be used for commercial and sold in commercial. So when we move the data across to the patients and we have that Jersey care record, it's not necessarily going to be an all or nothing thing, but we'll start small and evaluate at each stage. Again, it's just taking that process of, we've already talked about before, doing these small proof of concepts, trialing it, working back and having that two-way process. It may not work at all. It may only work in certain areas, but I think it's worth a go, because at the moment what we've got is we've got a great need to drive forward innovation, a great need to use data to do that, and then we've got a disconnect between this data that it's in the hands of the doctor. The doctor owns the data. It's all in the healthcare, and you have to write permissions to get your notes and stuff. Well, hold on a minute. It's all my stuff. It's all measurements of me, and it's all things that I'm doing. And there's that disconnect. It's just a historical thing from the 1950s of doctor knows best. We're moving away from that in healthcare generally. So I think we should move away from that in terms of digitization and data in healthcare as well. And that whole process should change, where the patient truly is at the center of everything we do, and it's a journey that you go on with the patients. No patient fits into a box, yet healthcare is desperate to squeeze every patient into a box every single time. And we need to just move past that. And part of that is democratizing the data and giving people access to go and make choices like that. But yeah, fair value, how much is the data going to be? That will probably end up being driven by market forces. But in the first instance, if you do it in a small piecemeal way, diabetes and blood sugar is a really classic example. It's a nice small defined area, and it's clear that we could potentially do that with our diabetes patients and see how that would evolve.
I think the really interesting takeaway for me from that is that we can't make the same generalizations in data that we do in the way that we think more generally. There's a big difference. Going back to the vaccine example from a few minutes ago, it's a massive difference between using somebody's data, anonymized data, for public good in terms of creating a therapy or a vaccine that will help us all, to actually using data and what the public sometimes gets stuck on, which is the idea that their data is being used for commercial gain. So there's a kind of different value point there. Joseph, you wanted to come in.
So I wanted to jump in and sort of move the conversation a little bit sideways. I agree the data, and I have a background in privacy, so I can fully appreciate all of the nuances and complexities here. But it's not just the data, it's the access that's significant. Traditionally, there has been a barrier to accessing people and as patients or as people with disease states. So for example, a number of people in industry that I talk to that are developing devices have an issue with accessing patients in context because of various kinds of barriers, both ethical, practical, but also cultural and traditional. You cannot in healthcare just go into a hospital and go into an ICU ward and say, I'm just here to observe. I want to know where the unmet medical needs are, and just leave me alone. It's okay. I'm not going to interfere. But at the same time, that kind of contextual inquiry has been shown to produce some of the most interesting and in-depth innovations, and at one end, and at the other end, to produce sort of or mitigate some of the assumptions and mistakes that designers, engineers make without having access to people. So even, we have graduate students, many of my students are clinicians, so that barrier has been reduced in some ways. They can just go into their practices. But if you don't have that access, or if you have to follow through ethical review boards, which I do and fully agree with, but many of them are sort of thinking in terms of publications and in terms of academic outputs, that prevents patient engagements at the beginning of the cycle of thinking about products, of thinking about interventions that will help people. So even that access to people, as a patient, if I want to give some researcher or some designer access to me so that it might help either me or someone like me in the future, I should have that right.
Interesting thoughts. I've got a question here from Ashwin. Ashwin, I apologize. I have no possibility of being able to pronounce your surname. I do apologize. Ashwin asks a question which gets me thinking a little bit. His question was a little bit more technical than I can manage. He was talking about whether cellular level research, so liver transplantation for liver tumor, has better scope for clinical translation as compared to organ level research, bioprinting of livers, because it's less complicated, holistically speaking. What I take from that, and Paul, I'm going to come to you on this one, is the question of whether does a translational approach apply equally, and can you apply it to any form of healthcare innovation, or are there some areas that are better than others? Paul, can you take that one for me?
Yeah, definitely. I'll maybe take a little bit of a step back and kind of present some of the thoughts that have been expressed so far into something close to like a general theory that takes into account the historical nature of the systems that we're working within, which is that when a lot of these structures were set up, we have a systemic scientific structure of how we do medicine, and we have that across disciplines. It was done very intentionally. It was mostly done after World War II, and it was done kind of on the model of innovation that achieved very, very good results in the war. And the world was much more simple back then, and science was relatively new. And so the way things generally happened is that smart scientists looked very deep into sciencey things and discovered something that could very easily be translated into something that worked. So, I study a bunch of stuff, and all of a sudden I find out that you can use radar. Now let's develop radar. And someone over here studied a bunch of stuff and found something that could be used for antibiotics. Let's develop antibiotics. And so there used to be something called the linear model of innovation, which was that you had basic research, which was just studying science. And it was actually important for that to be done with no application in mind, to make sure that you weren't biased towards particular areas. And then there was applied development, where you said, this thing that we learned, it doesn't really do anything yet, but we see a couple of different things. And then on top of that would be product development. And that had limitations, but was just incredibly effective for a while. Most of the structures that were built, the organizations, the funding organizations, the way universities work, kind of the way government funding goes into science, it's still kind of built upon that system. And so one of the things that's really important for this conversation to think about is how in the linear model of innovation, the prioritization of what we're studying is coming from the people that are closest to the science. And it's specifically not coming from the people that are the patients or the people that are receiving those products. And so not only have we solved most of the major problems, and coronavirus is such a huge exception to this, but not only have we solved most of the simple linear problems where you have a degenerative disease and a pill can basically cure it, we've solved all those easy problems. Now most of the problems that we have are degenerative diseases and complex systems, complex, smaller, like lifestyle diseases, where there's so much more behavioral elements to it, that you just need so much more information, whether it's trying to solve a problem or whether it's trying to develop something that could look something like a business. There's so much more of a need to understand the market side of it, the customer side of it, the patient side of it. And there's so many more niches to be filled. And so that, to me, that's kind of the general theory of what's being done in translational medicine, is acknowledging that this existing model, we have to work within it. We're not going to break the model. It would be too idealistic to say that, but to understand that we need just a much better mechanism of looking at individuals, all of us, the public good, and what's required to extract out of them. What are the next movements in applied medicine? What do they really, really need to be, and feed that back into the innovation loop? And there are not enough structures to do that right now.
What I love about what you just said, Paul, is the kind of moving away from a linear approach. The linear approach, and again, you can apply this fact to vaccine development in the last year. The linear approach, Joseph talked about the fact that a vaccine would normally have taken 10 years because you do it in that linear way. You start off by doing the science, and then you think about the clinical trials, et cetera, regulation takes 10 years. And the whole thing with the vaccine development, which I guess plugs neatly into what we're talking about here, is starting at lots of different points rather than starting at one point and making them all kind of move through. But Joseph, you wanted to come back on this.
So I actually, this is amazing because it's, but I'll extend this. It's not just the linear approach to innovation overall. It's also the linear approach of thinking the same person who makes that discovery will be somehow involved end to end with its implementation. The second you start thinking about multiple interdisciplinary teams, multiple starts and stops, even in the ideation or even in the development phase, you now have to have mechanisms, processes that are best practices to be able to not just select ideas that may come now from multiple people at multiple points in the process, but how do you select the best ones and how do you match the best selections to the outputs and the direction of the innovation. So even if you think of the whole process as from discovery into, application of an innovation, within each phase and each step, there are multiple teams now involved that are doing multiple different things iteratively in different ways without structure by trial and error. The point is, we have to get away from that. We have to have systemic approaches that help us, that are guidelines that could be in various times replaced with other practices as necessary, but have a systemic approach towards vetting, selecting concepts, then putting them forward to each step in the process so that we're not losing good ideas and our ideas we're developing are actually helping people and have a direction.
I think Ashwin's question was a very good one, because the question ultimately becomes about selectivity and which ideas can translate, which ideas can't translate. Being a little bit naughty, Heather Ann, I'm gonna play devil's advocate and ask you this question: how much of that selectivity is based on money, and should it be?
I think it's practicality more than money. Is this something that really works? Does it solve the problem that people care enough about to need? And then can we practically build it? In the 60s, when we decided we were going to build a rocket ship to go to the moon, people said, oh God, we'll never be able to do that. Now we've just had somebody land on Mars. Is it practical in the day-to-day, every day? No. Is it important in the longer scheme? Yes. Somewhere in the middle there, we have to find a way to look at what is cogent and necessary right now, and how do we help to find those opportunities and get them in a process that gets them along that way faster. Joseph talked earlier about the fail early and often. It's not that you want to fail all the time, it's that you want to have a fairly systemic approach to going through things so that you can work out early if they're going to keep moving forward, and so that you can say, yes, this makes sense to keep trying to progress to funding. But it's not just about the funding, it's about what is the stage to get there and what's the value it brings along the way, because failing is just as positive as gaining and making something work, because often that failure is the thing that gives you the light bulb moment that goes, aha, actually we need to think about it this way. So it's creating that ability to get some initial funding to trial and error those issues, to be able to bring enough of them to fruition that you can get the investment in the longer term.
It's a really interesting point, actually, but it brings to mind for me, I wish I could remember the name of the guy, but I interviewed a few years ago an eminent professor working in oncology who'd come up with a great idea of removing blood from people, sticking it in the fridge and doing chemotherapy on the blood, and then injecting it back into people. And the reason what you just said sort of brought this into my mind was because sometimes with innovation, there's an element of you discover something or create something which wasn't what you originally started trying to create. In this particular case, they were providing chemotherapy for this blood. It wasn't doing anything about the lymphoma, but they found out that it actually was having hugely beneficial effects on people with multiple sclerosis. How random is that? Jane, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, serendipity is a wonderful thing. And I suppose why we all do science is because we've all got those inquiring minds and pose those what if questions. I suppose coming back, we do at UCL apply that sort of the principles around unmet need in a systematic way, but really start with the end goal in mind and work backwards. And I think we are separate from our tech transfer office, who have a very clear focus on unmet need, but commercial market. Whereas in the Translational Research Office, we have the principle of unmet need. And if something's looking interesting and can address that, so long as we can find the appropriate funding and the funder is willing to take that risk, then we will support it and try to move it forward. And the gene and cell therapy is a good example of that 10 years previously.
I'm going to stick with you, Jane, if I may, because I've got a question from Siddhesh Kumar in the chat. Siddhesh asks, how can academic hospitals and universities support and promote translational research in their institutions? With UCL being an eminent university with some very, very strong links to academic hospitals, I think you're probably best placed to answer that.
So that's a great question. So as I said, we've built up a team at UCL to support this sort of translation from bench to bedside, if you like. And typically, there are a number, I don't like to categorize researchers because they're all different and they're all different in their levels of knowledge and experience of doing this type of activity. But typically, we have a limited resource within the team. Our tech transfer office has a limited resource in their team. Our clinical trials units have a limited resource in their team, et cetera, et cetera. And so we've been thinking for the last few years about how do we widen participation in this agenda and really get the knowledge that exists in our teams out there so people can access it in a friendly, accessible way. And so we've been working, we got support from the Wellcome Trust to develop a number of different mechanisms to aid people in understanding this pathway if they so want to do so. Because so we've developed therapeutic innovation networks to bring the community that's interested in small molecule drug discovery, biologics, drug discovery, diagnostics, etc., to bring that network together and introduce them to other people within the organization, because it's huge, that they might wish to collaborate with. But also we're developing online resources to help them think through what are the processes and thought processes I need to think through, and where can I go, more importantly, where can I go for support to access further information. And so these are the sort of things that we've been doing, developing mentoring schemes, developing challenge grants, we have proof of concept funding, a whole host of different streams for the academic, if they want to look for it, because that's the other thing, getting the communication to the academic so they know that all this amazing stuff is there for them, it is where we tend to struggle. So we're out there on social media, websites, newsletters, but most of it is word of mouth, face-to-face contact, which we haven't been able to do, obviously, this last year.
Joseph, you want to respond?
We are battling with some of the same opportunities. Our health network involves 9 affiliated training hospitals and 23 directly U of T affiliated hospitals, and then 23 partially affiliated hospitals. We have something like 8,500 researchers in health sciences spread out across the Greater Toronto area, all of whom are appointed to our one medical school medical faculty. So we have a tremendous, both within the institution and external to institution, issue of pockets of people, silos, spreading, communicating, linking researchers to each other as well as industry. So that's what one of the organizations that I've started as well, MyTO, Medical Innovations Toronto is actually part of, it's a global hub for translational medicine as part of the Eureka Institute for Translational Medicine, who have a number of hubs around the world growing and developing that are looking specifically in these areas. So there is a movement to combine community within local contexts, global contexts, to combine academics with industry and governments, and but it's still very small. The amount of money being devoted to actually applying research, translating research, is a fraction of developing research. And I completely understand that, because you do not want to take money away from actual discovery. Without having actual discoveries, you have nothing to translate. So you cannot, absolutely cannot remove the money from that end of things. But then how do you fund this end of things if there's no more money to be had from governments? So this is where the bigger problem of collaboration with industry, figuring out ways to optimize this translational pathway, is absolutely crucial to the future of innovation, because we do need ways of funding and collaborating and understanding. And I think that that can only come from better relationships with industry, more focused government grants in this space, or particular mechanisms that are also then offset or invested in by industry.
It's a really interesting point. And I think, when you talk about discovery and you talk about money and you talk about the money that's available to research things, I guess, and I'm going to come to Paul on this one, because I think it relates to how things operate across the tech industry. Is there an element, and does translational healthcare help us get to this element of actually being able to reject stuff quicker? And that might sound like an odd question, but at the end of the day, the number of innovations that I've seen, particularly in digital healthcare, where you've got a well-meaning clinician or a well-meaning tech entrepreneur who's trying to solve a problem that doesn't really exist. And actually, is there an element, can this collaborative approach get us to the point of being able to look at an innovation or an idea and quickly go, actually, no, that's not where we should be going, and therefore being able to move the money and the resource onto things that are more immediately opportunistic? Paul?
Yeah, I think the answer is definitely yes. And on a most simplistic level, you need researchers. To a certain extent, there's a huge amount of value in basic research that's not geared towards any end. But if a researcher is attempting to solve a particular problem, it's useful that that problem is one that is an actual problem, just most basically. And it's actually incredibly common, and anyone who's worked in any science or engineering organization has a dozen really hilarious stories about this just in their back pocket, about people just researching things. And there's even kind of these like mutual adoration societies of a bunch of people researching this thing that nobody except them thinks are important. But I would say that there's another element too that's a little bit more tricky, which is that oftentimes for something to be commercially viable, it's no longer the type of thing where you have a simple product and a factory that builds that product and then you sell that product for 30 years and it's the same thing. Like, those days are just so long gone. And most commercial businesses are not just a particular product, but they're a particular product that has to execute at a particular cost level and often needs to be bundled with with some other elements for it to work, and for it to have a really smart distribution channel as well, and then kind of the right marketing. And so it's not just as simple as, oh, like people like pink teddy bears. It's kind of more like somebody needs this delivered, and it needs to be delivered in less than 2 minutes, and you need to be able to buy it a certain way. It can't take 3 weeks to get there, and it needs to include all these other things. So I'm very active in insurance. And so when we put together development programs to develop a new insurance product, even though it's just an insurance product, which is so much simpler than anything in medicine, we still need analysts who are doing the statistics and the AI to figure out what the pricing should be. We then need underwriters who are figuring out exactly what the policy coverage is. And those two things need to speak to each other. And then we need to know, how are we going to sell this thing? and how does the customer actually buy it? How do they want to buy it? In the channel that they're buying it, what are all the different competitive pressures there? And some of those are direct. This person's selling the same thing. Some of them are very indirect, like, oh, they buy this other thing, therefore they don't need it. And then you look kind of over time, how is this going to change over the next couple of years? What are the market dynamics? What's the recent history? So it's very easy to say, like, oh, what's the business considerations for this, or is there a market there? And that is something that needs to be considered. But in any kind of digital health delivery, there's actually many other considerations as well. And there's different types of business analysis that go into turning something that's been developed into something that's actually a viable business. It's also really helpful to take the idea that there are exploitative businesses out there that are monopolies, and those 100% do exist, and we read about them all the time. But they're also kind of the exception rather than the rule, and government policy should be regulating those better. For the most part, what businesses are doing is they're taking research that needs to be implemented. They're finding ways to implement that very easily, and they are the mechanism by which knowledge is diffused. And so they do play an important role in defining not just what needs to be studied, but also how does it need to be studied. And to make this more concrete, the medical version of this can be things like how important is this? How many side effects are acceptable for this particular medication? If something's really life-threatening, you can probably have more side effects. Who is going to buy this? What are their age groups? Like, what type of interventions? What are the different ways that you can solve a particular problem? Maybe you can solve a particular problem among the elderly that just wouldn't work with younger people. And so being able to put more requirements on the size and shape of the problem that you're trying to solve before you attempt to try to turn it over to a business is incredibly important, because things that you wouldn't think matter can end up absolutely making or breaking the ability to commercialize that.
Thanks for that, Paul. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to sort of turn us towards reaching some conclusions with this conversation. So I'm going to use the remaining 10 minutes just to go around each of you just for a few final thoughts. And I guess what kind of drives this for me, as the novice in the room with a lot of people with very big brains, my very small one, I look at this from the point of view going, this is great. It's really interesting. It's really fabulous to see this idea, this approach to actually creating some kind of practical framework to how we get innovation into our health systems. But I guess from each of you, what I'd like to know is, what is your one piece of practical advice or practical thoughts for how you make translational medicine the standard way of getting innovation out into the health system? Just to make this things a little bit fairer, I'm going to tell you what order I'm going to do this in. So I'm going to start, Jane, if I may, with you. Then I'm going to come to Heather Ann for a final financial thought. Austin, for your ideas on how to practicalize to do it practically in the marketplace. Paul, from the kind of tech point of view, and finally, because I know he'll have the most to say, to Joseph. So, Jane, to start with you, practical advice then. How do we make this the standard way of innovating?
Gosh, well, I think it is. I don't think any of this is rocket science. I think it is the standard way of translating healthcare. For me, I think it's about looking at the changing landscape. If I think about drug discovery 10, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, they were doing their own R&D. And then, they've pulled back from that. And so government have therefore incentivized academics to step into that gulf and do more. But potentially, even the funders knew that there was some knowledge gaps there. You can't just suddenly turn academics that are looking into blue sky research into suddenly applied scientists and developer scientists, and they don't necessarily all have the understanding of the steps involved. And so the whole situation in the UK was about getting that experience into the academic base. Now, since then, pharma continue to remodeling, and CROs are taking a much more important role in the ecosystem. And so it gets more and more complex, and academics just need to focus on what they do and what they do best and use the support and knowledge that does exist. But the problem is it comes down to how do you fund that and that systematic approach in an academic setting when the pressure is to fund the next exciting project and the next exciting project, and you're not really catalyzing the shared learning within the academic organization. So I don't think the conclusion is it's not rocket science, it's all imminently doable. It's about making sure finding the academics with the great ideas and giving the support to allow them, to encourage them to move out of their comfort zone and into that sort of collaborative partnership space to develop their idea.
So Heather Ann, how do you fund it?
I think it's a collaborative approach, and what we need to do is get the investor community and the healthcare research community working together sooner in the piece, creating a standardized approach to the way that you're going to go through the end-to-end processes, and giving potential investors and giving whether they be government or commercial or private, giving them an understanding of what the steps are and what people are going through, so that if you've got those folks who've come up with the ideas, getting more comfortable with stepping into a more commercial perspective, getting some help and guidance from mentors and collaboration and innovation hubs to actually get themselves more commercialized, but allowing those potential investors to spot in earlier to see what's going on, and perhaps being able to step into that journey and be part of that network and support process while they're getting ready to go to funding, then you've got a much better approach, because you've got the investors being able to de-risk their investment decision because they're seeing more and they see it's a more standardized process. You've got the researchers seeing that there's actually people that they can talk to and that there's a process to help them get there in a much more streamlined fashion, improving the funding experience, as Joseph described it once. And then you've got that collaborative approach across the whole ecosystem. And that's always been the challenge up until now. You don't have everybody in that ecosystem in a single collaborative hub to work on it together. And if we could get people working together, we could leverage what we did with COVID and do that, continue to do that for innovation, we will be exactly where we need to be.
Austin, how do we get this kind of stuff out there in the world? By pressing our mute button, probably.
Yeah, it's the easiest way to answer the question. At the risk of sounding like a marriage guidance counsellor, the sort of too long didn't read here is talk early and often, isn't it? Really, and it's about that sharing. I mean, there's lots of talking within a team and within groups, but also internationally and collaboratively, and sharing where those successes have happened, where those happened. Whether it's in the implementation side or whether it's in the research side. But we're all talking about, Heather Ann's just expanded there about the investors understanding the journey the academics are going on the steps they have to take, so they can see a roadmap of where their money might be needed at what point. At the same time, the academics can understand where the investors are coming from, that we can't put money in at phase, that sort of money in now, but we might be in the future if you meet such and such. Then it's the patience. We're doing this because of this, and this will mean this for you in the future. So we want to engage you now. Does this work for you? Would this work for you? Is this a problem? Are we seeing something? So yeah, it's just really about talking early and often and sharing. And the forums like this and digital health networks and Bob Health and all these kind of different forums where these sort of things are exchanged and discussed, and we make these connections, is how we're going to do it, really. And that's how we did COVID, really, was by talking early and often as an international community. Yes, there were the inevitable real politics of modern life, but in terms of academia and science, it was lots of people talking early and often, and I think that's how we'll do it.
Paul, your final thought?
Yeah, I think I'll reiterate the idea that what Heather Ann is doing is just incredibly interesting, not from just de-risking the funding process, but also by creating an early feedback loop that kind of influences what is happening in the later stages of development, which is hugely valuable. I'd say that one of the things embedded in that investors could bring, things that that good investors do, and things that organizations like NASA do, is they'll create a 10 to 20 or even 30-year roadmap of where they think the industry is headed, and that is not just technical. That is driven by economics. It's driven by trends. It's driven by changes in customer behavior, and so that you're innovating not just into hey, here's what happened in February, maybe in March it's going to be the same, but you're innovating into, oh, here are the different trajectories that are going to define the next 20 or 30 years. And here's how we filter our ideas through that. And that's incredibly important, because some trajectories that we're on, we know are dying and are dead. And it's, anytime you develop a sustainable business, you need it to work for, at least the 20 next foreseeable years. And so you need to know, are there big movements that are going to make this obsolete very soon? Is this aligned with the way customer behavior is changing? Is this aligned with the way that patients are changing and their needs are changing? And so being much more clear about that future roadmap. It's obviously probabilistic. Obviously, roadmaps are always a joke when you look at them in retrospect, but they do represent like the best available knowledge we have about how the world is changing. And so more awareness around that, I think.
Joseph, your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to summarize and provide a final word to this debate in 1 minute. Go.
I don't think there's a standard way to innovate. I think what's been missing and what we're starting to implement is this feedback loop. The understanding the practices and principles, and constantly studying and evaluating how best to mobilize knowledge in particular contexts. That's what's been missing, and that's what needs to be funded and developed as a collaborative approach between stakeholders, so that we develop a set of practices, and as those practices inevitably become outdated, we start understanding through feedback and research how to adapt practices to better innovate in the future. And the feedback loop can be done with lots of things like research, data, machine learning, iterative practices. But the point is that we need to have our failures and our successes inform how we innovate better in the future.
Thank you very much, Joseph, and thanks very much to the whole panel. I came into this session as a complete novice to this whole idea of translational healthcare. I leave it, as I'm sure most of our audience do, with a fascination and a thirst to understand more about it. I think the whole idea of, I think James said it perfectly, it's not rocket science, it's not new. Austin said it perfectly. Let's just all talk and have a conversation and communicate. It's about, for me, understanding how the different elements of innovation come together. It's not just from bench to bedside, but actually out into the world, out into the community in a practical, properly funded, commercialized way. And when we talk about commercialization isn't necessarily about making profit. It's about making sure that something is sustainable, works, and has a long-term future. So, all that remains to me to say really is thank you so much to Jane, to Joseph, Austin, Heather Ann, and Paul for what has been, I think, a brilliant session. Thank you so much to our audience as well for posing what I thought were some brilliant or really interesting questions. Hope everybody out there has enjoyed it. If you want to watch the session back, it will be available on the Healthcare World website for the next 3 months. I certainly will be watching it back. I'll also be looking, hopefully, to create an interesting article for Healthcare World magazine based on this. There will be more of the Healthcare World Festival tomorrow, when we'll be discussing partnerships between the private and public sectors to advance healthcare agendas in the Middle East. And we've got a packed week. We've got a session on Thursday on the future of healthcare in Africa. We've got some insights into the South African healthcare system. We've got a fantastic session on working with the major development banks around the world on large healthcare funded projects. So please do join us all for those. Thanks very much to my panel. Thanks very much to everybody for watching. We'll see you again very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You see.